exactly well known, but you can also find him in the Zero Divide games. Here, he and a bunch of other crazy animals are playing footy, and the game's very good indeed. You get a couple of ways to use your special abilities, whether it's for a big shot or to run very fast and walk the ball in, and all the usual controls are nicely done too. Lots of aerial battles, good passing around, speedy play. This is by far the best game of this sort on the SNES, and honestly, it knocks the more famous Mega Man Soccer on its arse. Kind of a shame that it never left Japan, really. It is honestly one of the best football games in this whole video, which certainly isn't something I expected when I first booted the game up. A definite recommendation. While we're firmly in Japanese game territory, we should look at another sort of football game that's a lot more common over there. The sort that's a bit like an RPG, usually featuring an individual, a totally different sort of play, and a whole lot of story. And naturally, this means a lot of Captain Tsubasa. The goal-scoring superstar hero from a whole load of manga and anime that started out back in the 1980s, Tsubasa Ozora has 4 games on the Super Nintendo, and unlike the original Tecmo NES game, none of Tsubasa's SNES efforts left Japan. As such, there's a lot of intriguing things to be found here. But he isn't the only one in this section. There's another RPG type game, and I've also chucked in a couple of youth soccer based games that kind of seem to fit best in this part of the video. Anyhow, on with the glory of Captain Tsubasa. These games are unlike any other that we've seen so far, although we did at least see an unreleased effort to port the original Tsubasa to the Mega Drive in the previous football video. The first 2 games here, Captain Tsubasa 3 Kote no Chosen and Captain Tsubasa 4 Pro no Rival Tachi, both work in a pretty similar fashion to the original games, and they represent something called cinematic soccer. You control all players on the pitch, but you mainly do so through a simple board of the pitch, while the fancy stuff happens in the top half. When you decide to pass or shoot or whatever, everything stops and you pick an action. Some of these are special actions that can be very effective, but they also cost more AP, so you only have a limited amount of them. The same also applies to being off the ball and tackling, or saving with the keeper. It's all a bunch of actions and a little bit of strategy. Now, your mileage may vary with these games, but I actually quite enjoy them. The pace is a bit slower, for sure, but it's a different and quite cool take on football, and I quite like all the cutscenes that you can get. Of course, there's also a whole lot of story and tactics here which are sadly kind of inaccessible if you don't know the lingo, but it's not actually that difficult to get yourself into a match and not very difficult to figure out what's going on. It's all quite enjoyable, really. For the 5th Tsubasa game, Hasha no Shogo Campione, Tecmo decided to switch things up a little bit, and they managed to do so to pretty good effect. This game is a bit more like a traditional football game. You have a more regular horizontal view and less of the big cinematics, but you still have the Tsubasa gameplay of stopping everything to choose the appropriate action. The end result for me is an excellent hybrid. I like that you have a lot more control over the players, and the action's a whole lot faster because everything happens quickly, you've got more traditional player switching and so on. And again, even though everything's in Japanese, I don't find it too difficult to recognise what the actions do. It didn't take long at all to figure out. I have to say that I think this game's great. Definitely a recommended one for sure. It is a shame that, as far as I can tell, there's only been an attempt at translating the 3rd Tsubasa game on the SNES. Hopefully the others will come in due course. There is one other Tsubasa game to look at, Captain Tsubasa J, The Way to World Youth. However, it's not by Tecmo. Bandai takes the reins on the game this time, and guess what? Yep, they managed to screw it up. We go back to the more cinematic style for this game, although it tries to be as fast as the previous game was and it doesn't work. Playing this is so frustrating because you get so little time to react. You're always running into trouble, the game's constantly fading in and out, it's hard to get any sense of where you are on the pitch, and the whole presentation's taken a huge hit. Sadly, this game is a complete botch job of the actually pretty decent series that Tecmo had managed to put together, and it's a real shame that the final SNES entry in the series wasn't produced by them. I would have loved to see something that expanded more on the fifth game's winning formula than, well, this pile of crap. Hey ho, even if this is a duffer, the rest of the Tsubasa games are worth playing if you enjoy this rather different take on football. Another RPG-esque game based off an anime is Aoki Densetsu Shoot, published by Atlus in 1994. The setup here appears to be a lot like Captain Tsubasa, but the football is a lot more conventional. There's not a whole lot of the cinematic trappings here or anything. That's not a problem at all, but sadly the match engine is pretty horrid. So ugly and unresponsive and hard to get anywhere at all with. So that kinda kills things really. It's a pretty obscure game and there's not much I can see that would ever change that. Certainly there's no reason at all to ever bother with this game when the Captain Tsubasa titles already exist, unless you're a fan of the original work this is based on. Oh well. Our final trio of games in this section are the Zenkoku Koku Soccer titles from Yujigen. These aren't strictly RPGs, but they do kind of fit in thematically. These games are somewhat unique in that they're based on teams from high schools, and no, not in a hot-blooded Kunio-kun type of way. It's proper scholastic sports, and presumably teams from real schools. From what I can tell, there are a lot of teams available. The odd thing about these games is that I feel they actually regress a bit over time. The first game from 1994 is a pretty generic side-on affair, but not all that bad once you get past the Japanese text and management options and actually get into a game. There's a good amount of goals at the very least. Unfortunately, the second game kind of falls into the traps that a lot of other side-on footy games do, in that it ends up being a thoroughly messy game of football. Like Sam Allardyce mud wrestling with Sean Dyche at Turf Moor, it's unpleasant to watch and thoroughly distasteful to participate in. The third game, 96 Senkoku Koku Soccer Senshuken, goes seriously in depth with everything. It's most certainly the game for you if you really love Japanese high school level soccer. It's more like a management title with tons of options. There's lots of tactics, a ridiculous amount of training scenarios to beef up your team, coaches, the job lot. Needless to say, this is quite tricky to understand if you don't know the lingo, which of course I do not, as you can probably tell by how I've likely butchered the pronunciation of the names of all these games. It could have had potential, but the match engine here is absolutely awful. One of the ugliest and most unplayable we've seen so far, and that kind of spoils everything else. Something had to suffer to get in all these important stats for what feels like hundreds of high school teams, I suppose. suppose. On the whole, yeah, if you're going to play sports games with high scores, I would stick to the fictional world of Kunio-kun. It's far more entertaining.
Okay.
Let's head back to the other side now. We do have a bunch of lesser known footy games from the West to get through before we go back to Japan for a bunch more J-League games and a final title that's amongst the weirdest and most intriguing football games that I've ever played. Now, the titles here may be a bit more obscure, although that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. Mind you, some of them are definitely stinkers. A couple of them are games you may know from the Mega Drive video, although there are a few unfamiliar names as well. Let's keep giving this video the full gun, shall we? Much like every other platform, the SNES got a version of the official World Cup USA 94 game by US Gold and Tiertex. This game can be kind of variable depending on where you're playing it. Despite the presence of the often despised Tiertex, I don't think this game's particularly bad on the Mega Drive. However, it's really quite terrible on the SNES. I'm not sure why. It still appears to be basically the same game, a top-down footy title that has a fair bit of sensible soccer inspiration. And yet, I hate playing this. This is one of those football games where you can barely even kick the ball out with the goalkeeper. It's so fast and the computer gets on it every time. Hell, it feels like you repeat this until the CPU eventually scores. I cannot stand it in the slightest, quite frankly. One of the worst football games on the platform without a shadow of a doubt. Put it in the bin, along with that stupid bloody mutt of a mascot. Sticking with US Gold, the SNES also has a version of Head-On Soccer, the game that's also known as Fever Pitch, depending on where you are. Now here, the inverse is true. I think this game's thoroughly awful on the Mega Drive, but it's not too bad on the SNES, even though both versions kind of look the same. This is a speedy isometric game where the rules are pretty lax, fouls are called occasionally, but generally you and your opponents just kick the crap out of each other. If you play in exhibition mode, all the teams have special players. From big strong bastards to show-offs who can do banana shots, there's a bunch of fun stuff to play with. If you play the tournament, these players get gradually added to your side as you go along. I have a little soft spot for this game on the SNES for some reason, even if it's not an especially good footy game. Perhaps it's just the comedy factor and virtual lack of any rules that does it for me. I don't know. What else are you going to do on a Saturday other than sit indoors and play old and unremembered 16-bit football games? We had the kickoff games earlier, and naturally we have a version of what most folk know as Goal on the Amiga. Here on consoles, however, it's Dino Dini Soccer, probably because Jaleco got to the other title first. This is another one that I didn't care for on the Mega Drive, although I actually don't mind this version here on the SNES for whatever reason. It's a top-down game, of course, and it kind of feels a bit different to the Mega Drive game, a little bit slower and a hell of a lot smoother. It sure is a hell of a lot better than the kickoff games on this system, that's for sure. Now, I'm pretty sure that Dino oversaw the Mega Drive version of this game, although I'm not sure if he did the same for the Super Nintendo one. Anyway, this is totally alright. Finally, in the world of games that we've already seen, here's Champions World Class Soccer, a game that had endorsements from various players depending on where you were. It's Ryan Giggs here in Europe, which is, not great nowadays. Anyway, I remember this game pretty much being a whole load of nothing on the Mega Drive, but here on the SNES, it's utter bloody dreck. The animations are so slow. Seriously, it feels like it takes a couple of seconds to kick the bastard ball, by which time you're quite likely to have had it taken from you. You cannot do a single flipping thing aside from run around like a headless chicken after a ball that you hardly have a hope in hell of getting, and when you do get it, yeah, good luck actually doing sod all with it. This is one of the worst games in the whole video, and it should be chucked away immediately. Ideally, it should be chucked at Ryan Giggs. The next game is one you've seen a bit of if you watch the Ocean Licenses vid, Manchester United Europe, the final game in Chrysalis's series of Red Devils endorsed titles, and the only one that actually made it to a console. While the other Man United games are honestly pretty lousy, this one's not too bad. The influence that it takes from Sensible Soccer is very obvious indeed, with a view that's pretty close to identical to go along with an isometric one, but it does a lot better job at imitating Sensi than something like World Cup USA 94 does. Shame that it doesn't have the banana shots and streakers from Football Glory, mind you. Anyway, this is a game that is thoroughly just fine. Something that would fit nicely in the mid-table of SNES football titles. You know, similar to the position that the real Man United find themselves in nowadays. Finally, in this section, we have one of the stranger and more ambitious titles, Tony Meola's Sidekick Soccer, something that I have touched on in the past. It is strange for a start because it's a serious footy game that has a goalkeeper's endorsement, which, I don't know, strikes me as a bit unusual. It is also a definite standout from the other games in that we go for a much more 3D pitch. None of that wimpy super soccer nonsense here, because this camera actually rotates. Does it work? In the end, it is perhaps a bit too jerky and slow to really hit the spot. When the possession's switching around and the camera turns into a whirling dervish, it can be a trifle nauseating. With that said, I do respect Sculptured Software's effort on this game, and it's not too bad to actually play. I rather think it works better than the basketball games that they did using a similar engine. In all honesty, I can't say that this one's bad at all. I mean, it is certainly different. Our final section takes us largely back to Japan, where we have quite a lot of games that are based on the J-League. Certainly a lot more than the Mega Drive had, and perhaps not surprising seeing as the league itself was popular and still pretty new, only founded in 1992 after all. In short, if you want teams that have great mascots and fantastic names like Kashima Antlers, Verdy Kawasaki and Nagoya Grampus 8, this has got to be your console. A couple of these games were released in the West too, naturally without the J-League license. And hey, we've also got another Serie A game. And we'll end with a completely unique duo of football games that probably surprised me more than any other. Our first port of call here takes us back to Capcom, who did make a trio of football games that didn't feature Mega Man, if you can believe it. The J-League Excite stage games came out in 94, 95 and 96, and the first one did get a Western release as Capcom's Soccer Shootout. And frankly, even if you can't bear the thought of any kind of football game that features video game characters, I would still recommend going with the Blue Bombers title over this. These games are complete dreck. They don't even evolve all that much in any department. All three of them are the same sort of unpleasant, bad arcade side-on football that we've seen far too much of already in the video. They don't even bother to let you know which frickin' player you're actually controlling, which is, something that I would kind of consider to be a basic part of any football game, but is something that this and a few other games decided just wasn't worth bothering with. I guess that the last Excite Stage 96 installment is the best one, but honestly, they're all absolute shite. It's rare to find something crap on the SNES that has Capcom's name on it, but these games most certainly fit the bill. Our next trio of games comes from another storied Japanese name. Here's Namco and the free J-League Soccer Prime Goal games, the third of which was released in Europe as 90 Minutes European Prime Goal. This makes for an odd little trio. Generally what I expect is for these games to get better as they go along, but that's not really the case. The original is a pretty dull game, not much that we haven't seen before in all honesty. You would find it hard to differentiate it from many of the other games we've seen. I mean, if it were in one of Ashen's quizzes, it would be a definite "the last two are bastards" question. The second game, Prime Goal 2, is actually not too bad. Much more nicely balanced, less of the usual arcade bollocks. One different thing that the games do that I'm not sure about are these quick-fire one-on-one cutscenes that happen in play. They seem to play out like a Junken match or something along those lines, and they kind of feel rather awkward. But hey-ho, not too bad a game. The third one, unfortunately, feels like a bit of a regression back towards what was in the first game. I mean, it's not the worst I've seen, but I can't think of any reason at all why you would ever fire this one up over some other better titles. Of course, back in the old days, it depended just on what you had. You probably wouldn't have had a whole range of footy games to choose from, like we do now. You'd have had just one or two in your collection, that is. But when we're having a look at all of them, yeah, I don't think this one's aged gracefully. And here's another trio from a big dog. This time it's Hudson Soft, and the games are called J-League Super Soccer. The first one of these did come out in the West, and it was simply called Virtual Soccer. This time we have the more traditionally annoying thing. The original game that we saw in these parts is bloody awful, yet another attempt at football that trips over its laces, misses an open goal, and falls flat on its arse for the same reasons so many other games have done in the past. Just stick it in the bin with all the others. The two games that we didn't see, however, Jikyo Stadium and Dream Stadium, they're actually pretty fine. They benefit from going down the more traditional side-on route, with a game of football that doesn't have to try and be too fast and with a pretty good standard of graphics. They don't exactly reinvent the wheel or anything, but they're satisfying for anyone looking for a nice little game of soccer that comes with the endless, military precision levels of chanting and noise-making that defines Japanese football. I do wish that there was some sort of marker for the person you're controlling, mind. Why is that not a thing in so many of these games, for heaven's sake? Anyway, I quite like these two games. Right, we are nearly at the very end now, just about done with the J-League. So, how's about another adventure into Italy? Here's Shiho Saikyo League Serie A Ace Striker, a game by the fairly obscure publishers TNN. The kicker here is that the graphics are done in an anime style, not quite super deformed, but certainly different. So yes, you finally have the option to see the likes of Paolo Maldini, Franco Baresi and Alessandro Del Piero in cartoony forms. To be fair, the graphics look bloody great, and the odd cutscenes for goals are kind of cool. That and the football itself is fine. Takes a little to get used to, but it's an okay enough play and it actually allows a bit of variation in goals, which I appreciate. I mean, it's nice to have one of these games when you actually have a chance of scoring a long shot, rather than absolutely having to get into the area every time. It's a decent looking game, it's a decent playing game, and the only thing it's missing is an anime James Richardson with a sardonic grin on the piazza and a copy of La Gazzetta. Actually, that would improve every single football game, in all honesty. Anyway, this is decent. And so, we come to the last two games, and I've saved something pretty different for the end. Games that aren't quite football and aren't quite management, and are in fact unlike any other footy game I've ever played, and I've played quite a lot. Here's Zico Soccer and Tactical Soccer, Japan-only games released by EA Sports? Yep. The big dons of the sports game are behind this one, and yet they never saw release outside of Japan. Zico Soccer's the first one, released right at the very end of the Brazilian legend's pro career when he was playing for Kashima Antlers. As far as Brazil tie-ins go, yeah, it's a lot better than anything with Pele's name on it. So, what's this about? Well, it could almost be described as a point-and-click football game. Now, I'm sure that doesn't sound very appealing, but stick with me. In this game you have two different displays, a traditional side-on view and a radar of the whole pitch. You can click on both of them to move your players. I find that the traditional view is best when you're off the ball and defending, making shorter moves and blocking attackers, while the board is best for everything else. You can use it to set up long runs or hit longer passes. Naturally, this is unlike pretty much any other footy game in this video. And you know what? It actually kind of works. I wish that switching between the two was a bit quicker, but I like the concept and the tactical nature of it all. I'm not sure if this game's compatible with the SNES mouse, but that would certainly help things even more. It takes less time than you might expect to get used to playing this game, and I would honestly recommend it. It's at least worth giving it a go, because there's not a whole lot else like it. The second game, Tactical Soccer, follows the same formula only with things changed up a bit. The original game's a bit slow, whereas this one tries to be a lot quicker. I'm not sure if this is too good a change. I find with this one that I focus almost entirely on the board and never see the action, which is fair enough I suppose because you can't click on the regular side view anymore. I suppose the devs knew this would be the case, so you do get replays of various shots and actions when the ball goes out of play. Again, there's a lot of scope for things you don't usually see in the 16-bit games. Simple things like passing into an area and having players run onto the ball, as opposed to always passing to feet, or picking exactly where to hit the ball so you can curl it a bit. You don't see these sort of things in basically any other 16-bit console footy game. On balance, I prefer the original Zico Soccer, but this one is perfectly fine too. I wonder if there were any plans for these games to come out in the West, seeing as Electronic Arts is on them, or rather their Japanese win, Electronic Arts Victor. Would they have been some sort of FIFA spin-off, perhaps? I guess we'll never know, but they certainly make for a wholly new football game experience, and a refreshing surprise. And they make the whole process of playing every one of these SNES football titles, no matter how humdrum, very much worth the effort. And with that, we've done the whole lot. A quite frankly ridiculous amount of football games for a single 16-bit system, all sorted out and given a fair shout. It may well have felt like a bit of an endurance test at times, but we made it, and hopefully it works as something for the completionist or a simple trip down memory lane. So what comes next if we do this again? Some people have mentioned the Amiga, of course. Well, I can tell you now that the venerable Amiga has easily over 100 football games ranging from regular play to management, and such a colossal project is, quite frankly, inconceivable. Or is it? Well, we shall see at some point, I suppose. But it's time to blow the whistle on this video here, to say that I very much hope you enjoyed it, and to finish as ever by saying, bye for now. It's been a little while since I've done a top 100, and that one was for the games that I consider the very worst. So today's one should be a bit different. It should be something very close to my heart. The arcade. The arcade, especially throughout the 90s, from the beginning to the end, was a big part of my life. I did a lot of growing up in them, I played an awful lot of them, and I had all different kinds of fun, whether as a bright-eyed little turd or as a teenager. I've been meaning to do an arcade list for quite some time and, well, at last it's here. The 100 games that, at least for now, represent the best of the arcade, at least for the period that I'm comfortable with. These are all kind of old after all. The latest game here is from 2004, and it's a bit of an outlier. But there's a good mix of everything from late 90s 3D technical fests to simpler Golden Age classics, and naturally there's a lot of memories and sentimental things going on, so don't forget that. I didn't really try to put these games together based on things like technical power or their general importance or anything like that. They're my games, and it's loosely based on my experience. I have no doubt that if I put this list together again, even with the same 100 games, a lot of things would have changed, but I'm rather happy with what's here. And with all that, well, we've got 100 games to go through, and we should probably start doing it. Let's go. So this is certainly a game to start with. I mean, Pit Fighter isn't even that good. It's an amusing mess of a digitised fighting game with a concept and story that's hilarious. It's so cheesy. It's as if someone made a tie-in game for a direct-to-video trash flick that would take pride of place in a red letter media video. And yet, at least in its arcade version, it's a load of utterly mindless fun where you hammer buttons, laugh at the various ridiculous characters, everyone from the fat gimp, the 80s hair metal music video girl, and the guy who's wearing nothing but chains and a fawn, and generally enjoy themselves. The home versions of the game may be bloody horrid in most cases, but the arcade is still where it's at. Soccer Brawl is the first of a good few SNK games on the list. It'd be one if they didn't have a whole bunch of entries, really. It's not exactly the most famous one or anything, but there's always something appealing about a take on football that allows you to perform ridiculous super shots and also blast people rather than boringly tackle them. It's kind of a take on their own more famous Super Sidekicks games, but the future sports editions make Soccer Brawl a fair bit more fun than those titles are for me.
Kickoff.
Now, here's one of the few cases of a microcomputer game actually coming to the arcade. Data East and Ocean had a bit of an agreement going for Robocop, meaning that Data East ended up porting Ocean's game, with a few little changes, to the arcade. An odd state of affairs, but the arcade certainly left a mark on me, being a huge Robocop fan growing up and everything. Seeing the movie is one of the first things I can remember even, so you can imagine I was all over this as soon as I started going to the arcades. The actual arcade itself is an okay enough side-scroller, although it's also an utterly gratuitous coin muncher, but hey-ho, it's Robocop, and therefore it gets a place. A few of the games in this top 100 are probably more familiar to me through their home versions than their arcade, and Renegade is definitely one of those. But even if the classic ZX Spectrum version of Renegade will always kind of feel like home, it's still a bloody good arcade, a very influential one where, originally, you played as a swishly dressed, hot-blooded high school teenager. In Japan, this was the start of the Kunio-kun series. The main guy in the Western version may have utterly lost his dress sense, but he can still throw a mean punch and kick. One of the starting points for beat-em-ups in the arcade, obviously surpassed by a good few games, but definitely plenty of fun. Here's a sweet little early arcade fighter from Taito. Great Swordsman gives you 3 attacks, high, medium and low, and 3 settings for sword fighting, fencing, kendo, and gladiatorial combat. It's a little evolution from the likes of Karate Champ and all of that, only with weapons and a little bit more forgiveness, at least until you get to the one hit and you're dead Roman stages. But being able to block with your sword and the satisfaction of timing a nice lunge makes this one rather cool indeed to this very day. As great as the NES Bionic Commando is, and it deserves tons of praise no doubt, I do believe people tend to be a bit unfair on the original arcade, which is a damn good arcade side-scroller enhanced by the ability to use a grappling hook to not just travel everywhere at blinding speed, but also boop enemies and generally push them around. The awesome soundtrack helps too, although it is even better when arranged by Tim Follin. Again, this is another one where I first played the game on a Speccy conversion, and a good one at that. This is a damn good game as well, and I really think it should get more love. Tekken 2 being at number 94 is perhaps a reflection on the series getting better and better over time, of course. It's certainly a game I loved, even if upcoming sequels kinda superseded it. Hell, the first Tekken wouldn't be too far outside the top 100. No one really talks about it at all anymore, but I certainly remember the first time I stumbled across it in the arcade and was wowed by all the lovely 3D that was going on, even more so than I was by the first Virtua Fighter. There's better things to come, but all the hidden character unlocking, combo throwing, and general iron fisting is very strong in this sequel. I always enjoyed the subtle change Bonanza Brothers got in the West. These guys aren't actual robbers. No. They're ex-thieves testing out the security systems of these buildings. Yep, absolutely. Nothing sus at all about that. Whether they're actually nicking everything or not, this game's tons of fun. A little odd for the arcade, but it works while also being really nice and crisp looking. Well worth playing the arcade if you're more used to playing it in the home. Data East's game, where you definitely don't play as James Bond, and that's totally your decision depending on the code you enter at the start, is a fine example of what they do. Not necessarily the prettiest game, but a celebration of all things side-scrolling where you get on your feet, get on a bike, get in the sea, and fight against all sorts of goons and bosses who, again, totally aren't Jaws or Oddjob. It may have been a small miracle that they didn't get sued to oblivion by the Broccoli's for this, but it was absolutely the best James British secret agent game until GoldenEye came along. MK2 is obviously great, although weirdly my arcade love for the series kind of extends more to the original these days. Maybe because the computer's less of a cheating bastard in the original? No matter though, if you had friends and you didn't get told to piss off by teenagers you tried to take on like I did, MK2's a superb sequel where everything's bigger, better, and nastier. The game that confirmed Mortal Kombat as something that was here to stay and wasn't just a bloody one-hit wonder. It's fair to say that when it comes to 3D fighters, I heavily favour Namco's work over the others. Still, it would be silly for me not to mention the impact of seeing Virtua Fighter for the first time, bleary-eyed, early in the morning at Gatwick Airport, sometime in the 90s. It certainly wasn't enough to wake me up. Back then, those sprites actually looked pretty damn real. And even though you may laugh now, it's still a very good fighter indeed. Enduro Racer is the first Sega Superscaler title on the list, and obviously it won't be the last. These machines ruled the arcades for a good while. This one here takes the almighty Hanon and sends it off-road, with the ability to wheelie and do massive jumps that avoid rocks, and hopefully don't send you flying off course and into a road sign or whatever. It's as fun and as energy pumping as most of the other big scalers. Vendetta. This is one of those beat-em-ups that stands out for a different sort of reason. Rather than being bigger and louder than everyone else, the key to Vendetta is how much there actually is that's going on, feeling like you have a whole load of different moves at your disposal.
Hit the east coast of Japan, with the epicenter being just 72 kilometers off the coast. The earthquake triggered 40-foot tsunami waves, decided to delay release in the UK, US, and the game was completely pulled and never released at all in Japan and New Zealand too because of a completely separate earthquake earlier in February. The game, however, did eventually get a release in Asia under the name MotorStorm 3. Many other games were affected by the earthquake, especially so those about earthquakes. such as Zetai Zetsume Toshi 4, or as it is known in the US, Disaster Report 4 Summer Memories, which got delayed straight into the next console generation. Australia got MotorStorm Apocalypse on the planned release day of March 17th, but Sony halted any further shipments and pulled all advertising for the game due to recent events. The US finally got hold of the game last, on May 3rd. Initial reception was lukewarm. The game received a slightly worse Metacritic score than the previous games, with reviewers praising the destruction, graphics, and intense arcade racer gameplay. It did receive some flack for its mediocre story and generic, brown environments. Now for my favourite part, where I get to gush about one of my favourite games of all time. Stay tuned, I'll tell you how you can play it yourself on PC. MotorStorm Apocalypse is a one-of-a-kind game. It's one of those rare treats that simply has not been done again, although Split Second was kind of close. MotorStorm Apocalypse follows the MotorStorm organisation, the ragtag group of off-road racer lunatics venturing into a Bay Area city which is totally not San Francisco despite what the Big Red Bridge will tell you, to race and party. Sound good? What if I said the city was evacuated due to an incoming earthquake and you get to race in the midst of the destruction? Interested now? The single-player story mode is sorted into 3 campaigns you play one after the other, each following a different character's path through the 2-day MotorStorm Festival. You'll follow a racer new to the festival, a seasoned member with a rivalry, and the founder of MotorStorm, who is voiced by Steve Blum, who you may recognise from everything you've ever seen. You play through each event once over the campaign, and the events take place over 9 areas, with each event at a different stage over the course of the earthquake. They're all quite distinct, now with night tracks, different routes, and you get to see how the city is slowly destroyed over time. The locations themselves are all unique, featuring a seaside carnival, a suburb, a suspension bridge, the financial centre, the docks, and the absolute best tracks in my opinion, the Skyline tracks, which have you race over rooftops and through skyscrapers, which is just really cool. Each story also has an intro and an epilogue, point-to-point races to get to the festival in the intro, then get the hell out of the city as it is completely destroyed in the epilogue.
Hey all, Scott here, and this is bad, real bad.
The epilogue has you race to an aircraft carrier to escape, but you've got to be quick because it will leave without you. The campaigns are also sorted in difficulty level. For example, the first campaign is on Rookie, but the second one is on Pro, so the AI does get harder over time. The roster of vehicles returns with a few new additions: the supercar, superbike, super mini, and the badass chopper motorcycle, all of which can be customised down to paint jobs, parts, models, and other unlockables. The overall gameplay of MotorStorm is mostly the same. Tracks have multiple routes, environmental factors can cool or heat up your boost meter, and the cars all feel weighty. One new addition is the Ram, which allows you to use up a chunk of boost to jolt to the side. Great for smaller vehicles to make turns faster, and even better for heavier trucks to wreck your opponents. NPCs play a bigger role too. You'll have rioters throwing petrol bombs at your cars, and a private military shooting at you, both of which can increase your boost and blow you up if you get hit too much. Feel free to run them over. However, by far, the coolest addition to MotorStorm Apocalypse are the incidents. During regular racing, tremors can hit, sometimes causing the track to collapse and distort, opening up new routes or closing off existing ones. You'll have to be quick with the wheel to avoid some. I won't show them all here, but about 2/3 of all events have incidents, and they all have excellent sound and visuals. They really have that scale of a disaster movie. I think it really makes the tracks feel like locations and not just roads with crap near the edges. They're quite scripted, but the first time around, they're always great fun. Also, I just think it's really cool when you race through collapsing buildings. I don't think you can really get that experience in any other game, especially the one with the Ferris wheel and the tornado. That one's my favourite. The soundtrack composed for this game is also excellent. The soundtrack consists of a few main themes created by Klaus Badelt, an experienced movie composer. and those themes were remixed and sampled by electronic music artists into an intense, fast-paced soundtrack. Have a listen. Overall, it's dubstep with a little bit of breakbeat and electronic dance thrown in there. It really fits the hectic gameplay. It's all on YouTube if that sounds like your jam. The game also had a very fleshed out online multiplayer mode with perk loadouts, lots of challenges, personalization options, unlockable cars, and a betting system which earns you more experience for winning. I say had because the online was shut down in 2018. As the online worked with a central server, it's likely it won't be back, which is a real shame because unlocking different vehicle models and cosmetics is now impossible. Some DLC was also planned, and while 2 extra events and a new track based on the Alcatraz prison were released later in a free update, a collectible in-game trading card references an unreleased track set in The Heights, based on the iconic steep hills of San Francisco. The DLC was likely scrapped due to poor sales, given the game only sold around 500,000 copies according to VG charts. Overall, I personally think this game didn't get the recognition it deserved and flopped because of unfortunate timing. There isn't even anything wrong with it either, except maybe an average story, ugly cutscenes, and a 30 frames per second cap. More about fixing that later. You have a few options if you want to play the MotorStorm games. If you already have a PS3, PS2 and or PSP, just buy the games. It's simple, easy, and the games are quite cheap in second-hand shops. If you don't have a PS3, you could try Apocalypse through PlayStation Now on PS4, PS5 or PC, but be warned that if your connection isn't good enough, you'll get some awful input delay. However, if you have a PC, you can use an emulator to have your PC replicate the console hardware. The catch, however, is you'll need much more processing power than the original hardware. You should be fine emulating PS2 and PSP with an average gaming PC, but RPCS3, the best PS3 emulator out there, recommends a 6-core 12-thread CPU. The GPU isn't as important here, so your $3,000 RTX 3090 won't save you now. If your hardware isn't up to scratch, try emulating Arctic Edge on PS2 or even PSP if your computer really sucks. For the PSP, you'll want to use the European version, otherwise you'll end up with a void below your car. The PS2 version is preferable, as it runs at 60 frames a second natively and even has split screen on PCSX2, which is what you'll want to use to emulate PS2. And PPSSPP for the PSP. Head to their respective websites and get them set up. I'll link them below. If you need a hold of the actual game files legally, I'm afraid you'll have to dump them yourself. But if that's an issue, then I would lend you my copies if I could. It's basically abandonware right now, and Evolution wouldn't see a cent of your money anyway, so don't feel bad about downloading them off their shady website. Don't tell the RPCS3 Discord though, they don't allow privacy. If you end up emulating the PS3 titles, be warned that you will need to fix quite a few issues. Thankfully, the RPCS3 wiki contains tweaks you should be using to get the best performance, and you'll need to squeeze as much performance as you can out of your machine. The RPCS3 Discord also has a bot that scans over your log files to check for any errors. You'll want to join that, by the way. Check the description. RPCS3 also supports patches which help performance, as well as uncapped frame rates and disable processing power hungry PlayStation 3 MLAA anti-aliasing. Here's the lowdown on the 3 PS3 games, some gameplay on my setup with a Ryzen 5 2600. Firstly, you'll have to enable right colour buffers to stop bright bloom effects. Do this on all 3 games unless you want to go blind. For MotorStorm, you'll just have to enable right colour buffers. Check the available patches too. There's one that uncaps the frame rate above 30. I managed to get 144 in some places. Overall, it's kind of all over the place. For Pacific Rift, you'll need to enable right colour buffers again, and also set the resolution scale threshold to 256 by 256, which will also fix the bloom. There's quite a few patches to choose from here. You'll want to disable motion blur in MLAA, but if your setup is struggling, get the variable FPS patch so the game runs correctly at lower frame rates. If you manage to run it well, feel free to disable dynamic resolution scaling for a little extra clarity at some points. For Apocalypse, you've got to set resolution scale threshold to 256 by 256 and enable color buffers again. Also, set the SPU block size to mega, sleep timer accuracy to as host, And also set the relaxed Z-Cull sync to on. These should grant a little extra performance. With the patches, you should pick up Disable MLAA. Disabling ambient occlusion and motion blur, however, are up to personal preference. If you feel you can handle it, disable resolution scaling and get the 60 frames a second patch. I should repeat that PS3 emulation is very processor heavy, as you can tell by my computer struggling. However, this all works, and RPCS3 even supports increasing the output resolution. It's possible to play all these games at 4K 60 frames a second, but right now I doubt the average person has that kind of hardware. It's a shame, but on the upside, in the future, when everyone has better processors, you'll be able to play all these easy peasy. So watch this space, and remember when you upgrade your setup. You might have thought that after 10 years without an installment, MotorStorm wouldn't have any fans left. You thought wrong. There's currently a small Discord of fans who love to discuss the game. The MotorStorm Festival Discord holds weekly time trials and occasionally plays Arctic Edge PSP online over the emulator. They even have a fan game currently in the early stages of development known as Project Stampede. It has a lot of promise, so be sure to check out where they're up to. There's also a few mods out there, mostly for custom libraries, especially this one by someone with great music taste, and also a rebalancing pack for Pacific Rift. I only really made this video because I don't think MotorStorm Apocalypse got a fair shot with consumers because of bad timing, as well as the whole franchise being a PlayStation exclusive. I think it deserves to be up there with Burnout and other 7th generation racing games. The whole genre of arcade racing titles has seemingly died now, but I don't think MotorStorm should be forgotten. In the future, as computers improve, you could emulate all these games as easy as people emulate a PlayStation 1 right now. If you miss the arcade racer, or even if you just want to try something new, I strongly recommend the MotorStorm series. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a boat to catch. This video took about 10 hours of research, recording, editing, tweaking and thinking to make, and I just hope it was worth the effort. I even emailed some X-Evolution developers, but none of them replied. I hope this video is an improvement from a green text video about a dinosaur dating simulator. I don't plan on making any more videos, but I could either make one on an alien shooting trilogy, or a jet fighter trilogy. Regardless, your likes and subscribes are greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching.
Bye.